Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second session of IFANS Conference on Global Affairs. And I'm the moderator for the second session. I'm president of IFANS, Lee Seung-Joo, and I would like to thank everybody for joining us in spite of their busy schedule for IFANS Conference on Global Affairs. I would like to thank everybody for joining us online on YouTube as well. KNDA, considering the corona pandemic, has decided to have webinar for IFANS Conference on Global Affairs. Yesterday in the evening, we had the first session of the conference with the scholars from around the world, and we talked about reinventing global order and multilateralism in the post-pandemic world, and we've had very in-depth and insightful discussion. All the participants have shared their concerns and interest in the future challenges in the post-pandemic world, and the international system based on the United Nations and the international organizations are not playing their roles properly, and many participants have shared their concerns and regrets about that and talked about the need for collaboration and cooperation in the international society. And some participants have said that newly shaped international order should be based on multilateralism, led not by some small number of powerful countries, but led by the coalition of middle powers and like-minded countries. Today, we would like to put the focus on Korean affairs, and we would like to talk about the reinvention of multilateralism and the potential role that we can play. And we have invited the best experts in this field in Korea, and I'm sure we are going to have a very vibrant discussion. We have 5 speakers, and because of the pandemic, we have taken all the necessary quarantine measures, and it's kind of awkward for me as well, but let me introduce you to the 5 panelists. To my left is Professor Li Xinhua from Political Science and Diplomacy Department of Korea University, and you could say Professor Li is one of the best UN experts in Korea, especially she has been deeply involved in peacekeeping efforts of the UN Human Security and Multilateral Cooperative Mechanism. Professor Li is going to talk about and propose the future direction for Korea's policies regarding the UN. Second panelist is Professor Lee Seung-Joo from Chungang University in International Politics Department. And Professor Lee is an expert in not just politics but economics, and he has been studying the nexus between economy and security and very much interested in cyberspace-related international economic order. He has been policy advisor for Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a long time. Third panelist is Dr. Chung Chul, the senior researcher for Korea Institute of International Economic Policy. Professor Chung has been the acting chair of KIEP until recently, and he is the best expert in Korea when it comes to trade policies of Korea. So he will talk about the changes in the international economic order and Korea's trade and economic policy directions in the post-pandemic world. Next, I would like to introduce you to Professor Kim Tae-won of KNDA. He is an expert in public diplomacy, and recently Professor Kim has been deeply interested in philosophical foundation and values for Korean diplomacy and has been actively engaged in policy recommendations. He will talk about the philosophical direction for Korea's diplomacy. Last but not least, Deputy Minister Ham Sang-wook for Multilateral and Global Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is the Commander-in-Chief of Multilateral Policies in Korea. He has also served as the Deputy Ambassador for Korea to the United States. He is also an expert in North Korean nuclear policies and bilateral diplomacy with the United States. He is the so-called master strategist of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So with these 5 great panelists, we are going to talk about the Korea's role in reinventing multilateralism. So we have given 3 themes to the speakers. We would like to give 7 minutes to each speaker, and after the presentations are done, we would like to follow with discussion. Professor Lee.
Thank you very much, President Oh. Today, I'd like to cover 3 areas simply. First, COVID-19 pandemic. What is the influence on global order? Second, multinational and multilateral order. What will be in the future? And third, future direction of the Korean diplomacy in the future amid COVID-19. First, COVID-19. What kind of influence did it give to the multilateralism as well as international order? My answer is yes, it did give influence, but this is not something new. Even before COVID-19 occurred already, there was a hegemony and competition going on, and protectionisms, regionalisms, they were all popping up here and there. Thus, uncertainties and a lot of confusions were already occurring. And also America First policy was taken by President Trump, and that is why countries were taking the positions of trying to find their own survival way. The conflict or confrontation between China and US already existed. With the COVID-19, it could have been a new chance for us to take a new leap into the future, and COVID-19 could have been momentum, but rather it put us in a fiercer and more heated competition, which threatened our future, making us not to trust each other, and we began to distrust each other, blaming each other, and our confidence level will totally collapse. So we are at a point of no return. So as you can see, in the health, in the trade area, the competition started, and now it is spreading to the UN area as well. So UN Security Council has been discussing various issues, but not anymore. Because of the power game between China and US, they are not able to discuss the major issues. And the international order based on the multilateralism is creating a power vacuum as well as the vacuum in the international order. Third, the new issues as well as the existing issues are coexisting. Of course, robot, AI, big data are giving us an unfolding of fourth industrial revolution era, creating a new wave of change, and COVID-19 is also bringing and accelerating the arrival of contactless society, which could be positive, but also there is a huge digital gap, creating once again the inequality and also digital gap. On top of that, the existing issues such as climate change, inequality, the poverty and pressure, all of these so-called chronic social issues on top of the economic issues and also conflict are creating a transnational issues. As I mentioned before, people are now trying to find their own survival way. So all of these, once again, is employed as well as displayed as a populism in each country. President Trump is showing an attitude that can be regarded as an attitude of trying to find its own survival in the UN and WHO, and also there are other leaders of our countries looking for only pursuing their own self-interest. So whenever there's an international crisis or global issues, we're trying to find a global scapegoat or trying to find someone we can blame on. So multilateralism is once again is something that can be easily used as an excuse. So leaders would like to make most of the populism, is trying to cover up their national issues or global issues with the issue of the multilateralism. Let's look at the East Asia. In 2016, SARS occurred, and that was a regional pandemic. At the time, multilateralism and governance was also an issue, but nowadays China is taking a new attitude, and that is called as a new way, as a wolf warrior offensive, and they are using most of that, and Southeast Asian seas and also Hong Kong issues are causing another issues. And such wolf warrior offensive is taken by China and global software, or they have lost all of these. Then what about ASEAN? ASEAN centrality, what about it? Is it solid? Unfortunately, COVID has worsened economic and financial crisis as well as health crisis, and giving a detrimental impact to the ASEAN as well, and thus creating a security issues, and global centrality is not being played by ASEAN or ASEAN centrality. In Europe, Germany, and France, they can play a critical role. Just like that, Korea and Japan could play an important role. But the situation is getting worse and worse, and we are losing the opportunity of playing an important role. So regionally and globally, we are losing the momentum to exercise multilateralism. But still, the international order based on multilateralism, we need to recover, revive that. Of course, as time goes by, the self-sustaining path is pursued by each country, and one virus is impacting people and is causing the damage to the people around the world. We live in the hyperconnectivity world, which is creating a crisis throughout the whole world. Amid such issues, instead of just looking for the multilateralism in a beautified way, but we are pursuing self-sustaining path for the survival, and in that sense, international order is critical for the survival of ourselves. If that is the case, can we recover or renew multilateralism? I think it was Amita yesterday who mentioned about this. Multilateralism always existed, but it was up and down, and there were always upheaval. Sometimes it seems like it's backtracking, sometimes it is ahead of us, but multilateralism was always right next to us, and we need to review and revisit how we can use this. John Rocky said the 20th century can be defined as a coming together, because we have an international organization which is a new creation. However, 21st century is a drifting apart era, and that is the topic. And right after the President Trump, we need to go back to the liberal democracy as well as liberal international order, and we need to recover that. Or just like China, authoritarian but also very strong public goods creation effort, will that work? So yesterday, speakers mentioned that that's not true, but rather we need to create a new way of finding a new multilateralism. We need to find a sort of a middle ground. However, if you look at China-US conflict and also the multilateralism, we feel like there is a war going on. So this is like having a China team or American team, and that is not a true sense of multilateralism. So based on the creativity, based on our own power, we need to create and reinvent multilateralism. It could be referred as a regionalism-based multilateralism or international organization based on multilateralism. Whatever it is, non-great powers need to play their own roles. So I believe this is the right time to do so. What I mean by that is the era of G2 could not exercise their global leadership. They were so preoccupied with their own agenda, trying to group their own powers. So non-great powers, including Korea, needs to equip themselves with a new direction so that we can create an advanced middle power. This is the right time to do so. When I say that, let me say briefly about the future directions of Korea's multilateralism-based diplomacy. We need to have a cool head and look forward. Instead of just reinventing multilateralism, instead of swinging to one side, because if we do that, then we cannot exercise the leadership because we have limitations of our own geopolitical issues. So the balance of power, we need to recognize that, admit that, and within the framework of maintaining and sustaining alliance with the U.S., we need to supplement the multilateralisms, and that's the more realistic goal. In light of that, the three countries, Japan, Korea, China, are not achieving any coordinations or cooperations, but we need to separate political and economic issues. Maybe we need to come up with a consensus or agreement, and regularly, at least once a year, it could be September or October, and although we have a heated discussion, we need to have a regular meeting, the trilateral meeting. If not trilateral, then at least bilateral plus one country, and then we can create an agreement or consensus. Second, with the arrival of G0 era, comparatively speaking, Korea is a small country, but Korea should be regarded as a country trustworthy. And K-quarantine is widely known, and one of the speakers mentioned about that. And not only K-quarantine area, but also UNPTO meeting is scheduled in Korea. And Ministry of Defense, Foreign Affairs, instead of segmenting ourselves, we need to put them into actions. And in order to do that, what visions or what discussions should we have, how we need to exercise our leadership? If we do that, it will be definitely helpful. That's for the public good, but also for the national interest. For example, 2024, we are trying to become a non-permanent UN Security Council members, and I'm sure that the next year's meeting can be very helpful because Japan is focusing very much on the environmental issues and human rights issues, try to become the non-permanent Security Council members. It could be background issues, but not the major issues. Last, what are the merits or the advantage point of Korea? Value regional cooperations and economic power. For that, we need to create a cooperative multilateralism, so discourse must be created. And once again, we need to be equipped with the competency of becoming a great power, but the current leadership or domestic situation is bipolar because of the populism, and once again, countries are very much preoccupied with going to the inward directions. And also, we are falling deeper into the black hole, and most of the political framework are formed. And we need to overcome that, and President talked about human security. And human security need to be pursued not to have exchange with North Korea, but rather human security should exceed and transcend the international viewpoint. And within that framework, we can talk about North Korea, international order, multilateralism, human rights, rule of law, all of these. Yes, we do have merits and advantage point. We are a middle power. We have protected liberalisms and Republic of Korea. We need to clarify our position. We need to stick to our discipline as well as diplomacy, and then we need to go beyond the political parties or political ideas. And in that sense, we need to make efforts.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. So we need to coexist to survive, and that is why we need to reinvent multilateralism. And the existing value of multilateralism should be the focus of further discourse in Korea. So now we are going to invite Professor Lee I know it's kind of challenging to wrap up in 7 minutes, but I would appreciate it very much if you could stay within your time. As Professor Lee has mentioned, I would like to focus on the 3 points that the organizer has given us. First, I'll talk about the impact of pandemic on the global order. COVID-19 pandemic is something that we have never experienced before. And it has created a lot of uncertainties in the international politics. In 2016, following the global financial crisis, Professor Barry Eichengreen has talked about hyper-uncertainty. And he has introduced this concept. The international order in COVID-19 is beyond this hyper uncertainty, but hyper uncertainty. So we are experiencing a lot of confusion. But in spite of that, as Professor Li Xinhua has mentioned, in spite of the confusion and discombobulation we are experiencing, COVID-19 definitely has clarified and disclosed some of the changes that have been taking place for the past several years. First, COVID-19 has happened in the absence of leadership in multilateralism. The current international order is very much confused because of this absence of international leadership. And this has greatly influenced the national level response to COVID-19 as well. As it is well known, the United States and major powers around the world are now trying to pay more attention to nationalistic interests, and the strategic rivalry between the United States and China has been accelerated, and it has brought about some breakdown of alliances around the world. So with the absence of leadership, the COVID-19 is spreading around the world, creating further challenges and uncertainties for multilateralism. On top of that, COVID-19 is closely related to globalization. You could say that COVID-19 is the cause of globalization, or globalization could be the cause or the resolution of the problem we are facing. COVID-19, since we are living in a hyper-connected world, has spread very swiftly around the world. And many countries around the world in the short term have imposed economic lockdown and cut off connection with the outside world. But in the long term, we need to find a way to reinvent the connection. That's where the solutions lie. However, that does not mean that we should revert back to the globalization of the past. The globalization that we will be experiencing is different from the previous one. And depending on how we define the concept of globalization, there could be diverse opinions. But in general, I think we're going to be experiencing globalization 4.0, and I think it's one of the biggest impact on globalization from COVID-19. And another impact of COVID-19 is the close connection between economy and security. So let me rephrase that. Mutual dependency is becoming weapons, and weaponization of mutual dependence is becoming more prevalent. So up until now, there has been mutual dependence between countries, mainly to promote peace and prosperity. So mutual dependency has been a mechanism of globalization for promoting prosperity and peace. But recently, there has been efforts by many countries using mutual dependency as a tool to oppress or coerce the counterparties. And this weaponization of mutual dependence is spreading very rapidly, and this phenomena has been accelerated by COVID-19. Last but not least, in the global value chain, reshaping of the global value chain, we are going to be seeing some qualitative changes. We are seeing nearshoring, reshoring phenomena. This is different from what has been done in the past because up until now, global value chain has been decided at the corporate level up until now. In order to enhance productivity and efficiency, companies decided where to put their production facilities. It was up to corporations to make that decision. And global value chain, however, has been playing a key role to all the people in the world. So people are now recognizing this as a public issue that has direct impact on people's health and survival. So with this recognition, some part of the global value chain will certainly be reshaped. Second point is that regarding the reinvention of multilateral international order, let me talk about the need for reinvention. This is related to trade. In 2008, we went through global financial crisis, and throughout the world, the global trade has been registering low level of growth, and it has become a structural issue. What I'm trying to say is that before 2008, the global trade has supported the global economic growth, and it has played a key supporting role for economic growth around the world. But since 2008, global trade is no longer able to pull off global economic growth, and this phenomena or trend is only being accelerated by COVID-19. So ironically, but one of the preconditions for recovering global economic growth is to recover the global trade. So global trade really needs the reinvention of multilateralism. The reinvention of multilateralism is, well, depending on how you define multilateralism, it could be seen as liberalist international order, and we are not going to go back to the international order of the past. We need two changes, first of which is that in the existing multilateral trade order, there has been some very outdated norms and regulations. So we used to say that 20th century trade regulations for 21st trade. So there has been a big gap. So we need to make efforts or reforms to narrow down this gap. Another change that we need is that in existing international trade rules and norms, they need to catch up with the changes. In some new areas of business, like digital trade, there are no rules and regulations up until now. In that regard, we need to design new shape of multilateralism, and we need transnational cooperation for that. And because of the time limit, let me move on to my last point. What should be Korea doing? In response to COVID-19, Korea has been very effective with its policies and measures, and in some areas, it has been a model case for other countries. This effort is sometimes called as K-quarantine. Regarding the reinvention of international order and multilateralism, we need to find a way to leverage K-quarantine in the best possible manner. K-quarantine, well, up until now, it was based on bilateral cooperation, and we need to expand that to transnational and multilateral cooperation. K-quarantine has a lot of advantages and strengths, but for most developing countries, they do not have the conditions that Korea already has. So if you export K-quarantine model without any change, it might not be effective in other countries. Therefore, based on K-quarantine model, there should be some localization efforts and collecting the best practices around the world, and new standards or global standards must be developed. And generally speaking, middle power countries should be ready to exercise stronger leadership. By that, I'm trying to say is I've talked about this key moment, and this is the moment for Korea to exercise middle power leadership. Moment here means that opportunity is open, but the opportunity will not be open forever. It will be open for a very short period of time, and we need to strategically leverage this opportunity, and this is the right time to do that. In principle, we need to pursue open national interests. Another point is that we need to promote middle power cooperation with other middle powers. Korea cannot lead everything. We need to move away from that idea. Up until now, there has been many initiatives designed to reinvent multilateralism, and we can also look into these existing initiatives and find a way to combine that effectively with the middle power of Korea. It's some of the opportunities given to Korea to reinvent international order. Thank you very much, Professor Lee Seung-Joo. Thank you very much. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we are all suffering, and multilateralism is also at risk. But at the same time, it could be an opportunity for a middle power like Korea. Thank you very much for your interesting idea. Next, Dr. Jeong-chul. I would like to give you 7 minutes.
We are at a critical juncture, and we are gathered here to discuss about multilateralism. And taking this opportunity, I'd like to express my gratitude to IFANS for hosting today's seminar. Just like other speakers, I'd like to share with you my thoughts on the multilateralisms, the causes, the backgrounds, what we need to do to renew and rebirth of the multilateralisms. First of all, COVID-19 pandemic is rapidly changing the whole world. And Professor Lee Seung-Joo already talked about it, but multilateralism changes already were happening before COVID-19. So-called deglobalization was happening. In 2008, when global financial crisis occurred, we talked about the emergence of new normal. Before 2008, for the past 2 decades, based on the industrializations, we have pursued, once again, internationalizations and multilateralisms, which causes a dramatic economic growth. But 2008 was an important point when the globalizations were staying at a static moment. So deglobalization started to happen. The COVID-19 pandemic is once again putting a brake on the damage to the economy and also the trading system. So once again, we're talking about appearances of new normal. When I say new normal, it means that the globalizations and economic growth that we used to enjoy before COVID-19 can never happen again. Even though we recover totally from COVID-19, still there are rippling effects given to the health and economy area. Therefore, we cannot go back and enjoy what we used to have before the COVID-19. So the uncertainty has expanded, and we need to adapt ourselves to this changing environment with a creativity. Industrializations and globalizations that we happened before, That's before the COVID-19, but in the future, digitalization is extremely important. So globalization based on digitalization or digital globalization will be a new key word. And the whole world will change based on the digitalizations. International trade, the format, the method will also change due to digitalization. So, the basic foundation of the globalization is because of the spread of the global supply chain. And because of the spreading global supply chain, global economy also prospered. But 2008 was a momentum when we all suffered financial crisis, which put a brake on the spread of the globalization. And what China did was one BRBD, and because of that was once again the worsening issues between China and US, and the global value chain began to collapse. And we can no longer talk about GVC just because of the cost, but rather stability needs to be our foremost importance. So, advanced countries are now doing a decoupling of China and reshoring policies. So, due to the concern about collapse of the global value chain, due to the intensifications of the US-China trade war, and also the security issues, once again, decoupling is happening. 2016 is also just like 2008 and also the COVID-19 pandemic. 2016 is very important because in 2016 the votes by the major countries to determine the Brexit happens, and President Trump became the United States president. That served as signal for strengthening the populisms and protectionisms. As inequality and polarization issue emerge mainly in developed countries, globalization is also contracting through the political process. Especially Lakhno and Milanov talked about elephant curve in 2013, and let me quote, in 1988 to 2008, the real income of middle and low-class workers in advanced countries, top 10 to 20% of the world, stagnated, while that of the middle class in China, about top 40 to 50% of the world, their income have skyrocketed. Once again, this has created complaint, and it also spread the protectionisms, and because of that, the conflict between the advanced and emerging countries intensified, and also trade disputes began to emerge between US and China, which started to expand the competition. And once again, after COVID-19, uncertainty arising from the health risk was internalized in transaction cost, acting as a major variables in economic activities and triggering the accelerations of the digital transformation, such as expansions of the contactless services and digital trade, and also changes in work due to the spread of the remote working and reorganizations of the global value chains to favor the safer production systems. And once again, we are witnessing the localizations of the GVC, reinforcement of the USMCA rules of the origins and promotions of the multinuclearizations. And also the rule of origin is extremely important to get recognitions for the rule of origin. In the past, NAFTA was 62%, but now under the USMCA, it's more than 72%. So everything has changed. In case of Korea, from the perspective of Korea, the regionalism is spreading, and trilateral crisis, trilateral means Korea, Japan, and Japan, we don't have much options. And within APEC, we have open regionalisms. And if we make most of that, once again, also new southern policy, new northern policy, if we make most of that, we definitely have various options in the future. Let me now talk to you about what kind of role we can play, especially in order to address the global issues such as health risk and digital transformations. FTA, which focuses on the economic and political issues, but that's very much limited. We need to come up with more converged international cooperation. And also FTA policies needs to be revised. And FTA and also the development policy need to be more inclusive. And R&D and health area, we need to pursue win-win strategy, and that should be our future direction. Especially as the digitalization is accelerating, there could be various policies. With the development of the digital platform, small and medium-sized companies can enjoy a greater opportunity to advance into the international stage. And digital infrastructure and international norms need to be revised or newly established. And in that sense, Korea can play a pivotal role, especially the participation in WTO e-commerce negotiation and efforts to settle and reflecting our profits in the multilateral agreement project to prevent OECD, G20, BEPS, tax source erosions and income transfer related to the global digital service tax. And definitely we can play a supplementary role, and we need to build a channel to do that. Thank you, Dr. Jung, for your comment. Yeah, GVC is collapsing, and amid such situation, how we can reinvent or renew multilateralisms, and what kind of opportunities are unfolded ahead of us for Korea, and in relations with renewed multilateralism, good options were suggested.
Next, Professor Kim Tae-hwan. Yes, thank you. I would like to also talk about 3 points. I think 3 points is kind of gaining popularity throughout all sectors of our society. But I will first talk about what multilateralism, how it is related to international order. There are 2 definitions of multilateralism. One that is based on formality. So more than 3 countries need to get together and adjust and coordinate their policies to promote cooperation. That is the nominal definition of multilateralism. More than 3 countries adjusting and coordinating their policies and behavior based on generalized principles of conduct. That what I mean by generalized principle is that countries gathered together need to follow the principles of procedure, but what's more important that would be the countries need to share values and norms. Sharing norms and values for cooperation is a very important aspect of multilateralism. There are 2 types of multilateralism: thick multilateralism, and based on thick multilateralism, based on common values and norms, this broad-based or comprehensive concept of multilateralism forms a very important pillar of international order. In other words, some form of generalized principles or some form of values and norms, what kind of norms and values are shared, can define the characteristic of the international order. The LIO, liberalist international order, means that liberalist ideas and values serve as the foundation of multilateral institutions like the United Nations. So multilateralism based on liberal values formed the liberal international order, and following the Second World War, multilateralism has continued to evolve itself, and until recently, at least until 1990s, it was cooperative multilateralism. So this was based on liberalism, and liberalism was the dominating values and norms. A lot of liberalist values were shared to realize cooperative multilateralism. But in the 20th century, it kind of shifted to more competitive form of multilateralism. There are 2 main reasons for this conversion, because after Cold War, people began to feel liberal fatigue. So getting tired of multilateralism, and since the 1990s, based on China, or the so-called emerging powers, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Korea is included here, Russia, these emerging powers kind of began to aspire for changes in their roles for the international community. Instead of just being a rule taker, they have become rule challengers, and they are also willing to become rule makers. Because of this, competitive multilateralism ensued. Competitive multilateralism happens when in the United Nations, you can see clear competition between, let's say, China and the United States. China has chairmanship in 4 UN agencies, and WHO has been a forum of fierce competition between China and the United States. So China talked about AIB, New Development Bank, coming up with alternative institutions of multilateralism. So there are strong competition between major powers. So there has been a shift away from cooperative multilateralism towards competitive multilateralism. And in order to overcome the crisis of this competitive multilateralism, I think we need to adopt inclusive multilateralism. And my idea of inclusive multilateralism, there are 4 ideas. First, it should be, regardless of whether it's liberalist or counter-liberalist, it should strictly based on centrist norms and regulations, middle of the road based coalition or solidarity. So following the Second World War, there has been clear change in the allocation of multilateral power, material power. And reform multilateralism is the second characteristic of inclusive multilateralism. And the third characteristic is, instead of waiting for the great powers to decide everything, non-great powers can get together and exercise collective leadership in inclusive multilateralism. I think the German professor yesterday, Tanja Bejel, has pointed out a very important thing. We don't have to have a great power. It's a myth. And last characteristic that I would like to talk about inclusive multilateralism is that there is a countervailing force against the power politics of great powers. Last but not least, what kind of role can Korea play for such inclusive multilateralism? The first thing Korea should do is change its perception. Korea's perception is strongly based on geopolitical victimhood. So we feel like we are forced to choose between China and the United States. And it's kind of very challenging to decide how to respond to their power competition. But instead of geopolitical victimhood, we need to create a new coalition of non-great powers. And I think there could be 5 roles for Korea to play. I won't go into the details, but the first role for Korea is to serve as by proposing centrist, middle of the ideas, and serve as a buffer for values and norms. And based on that, Korea should be building inclusive coalition. We shouldn't be exclusive. It should be inclusive. And third point is that Korea should be able to exercise more collective soft power. Up until now, individual countries exercised soft power, but when we look at the coalition, they can exercise collective soft power. And Korea needs to bring a lot of wisdom and insight together to create this collective soft power. Fourth is that Korea should be setting agenda for new issues. So we need to create centrist or middle-of-the-road ideas and values and turn that into specific agenda. Last but not least, Korea should be able to strike better soft balancing using non-military instruments. Korea should be able to contain the unilateral moves by strong powers by building the coalition. Thank you very much. Professor Kim, thank you very much. Since the 1945, the Western society's values and norms have been the foundation of multilateralism, but we need to replace that with centrist ideas and norms. Thank you very much for your insightful opinion. And we'll certainly revisit that theme or topic in the discussion session. Last but not least, Deputy Minister Ham.
Thank you, President Oh Young-joo. As I was introduced, I'm Deputy Minister Ham Sang-wook for Multilateral and Global Affairs. First of all, previous speakers already covered most important issues, and your suggestions and recommendations will be of a great help in promoting our multilateral diplomacy in the future. Thank you. There aren't many things to add in particular, as most of the important points have already been covered, so there's not much room for me to add. However, I was appointed as the Deputy Minister last March, and I served as a Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations previously. So based on that experience, I'd like to share my personal views on our multilateral diplomacy. Well, as other speakers point out three things, I will also cover three things. The number of the confirmed, the future directions that we need to go on, Korea's role, and also the current situation. If you look at the number of the confirmed COVID-19 cases worldwide, it has exceeded 25 million, and the mortality exceeded 850,000. We talk about new normal or preparing for the new normal, and contrary to our expectation, for the time being, it seems likely that COVID-19 is likely to be with us for a long time. That is pessimistic or a very dark expectation of the future. However, I am very much confident that we can overcome such crisis. The spread of the coronaviruses have dramatically exposed the limitations of the existing multilateral systems while requiring newer and more advanced international cooperation and solidarity. In fact, the issues related with the multilateral crisis is not a new issue, not a newly emerging issue that suddenly emerged. Rather, it has already been discussed as a central topic in UN for several years. The unilateralisms and protectionisms of powers, the confrontations and divisions between the superpowers, the financial crisis, physical pressures on the United Nations, and above all, the changes in international political system due to the rise of the various new actors make it very difficult to reach a meaningful agreement in the multilateral area. The current international political system, is it unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar? There are many questions. However, based on my experience, I think UN has, and also international organization has developed into a multilateral systems. The situations where various small groups such as ASEAN, Alliance, EU, and Latin American group, and Arab Group and Caribbean Association, all of these small size organizations are raising their voices, which make it more difficult to reach consensus or agreement in the international organization. In the early stage of the COVID-19, countries shut down their borders and total lockdown policies were adopted. Therefore, protectionism, nationalisms were prevalent. At the same time, the movement across the borders were strictly prohibited. The global leading countries like China, US, and Russia aren't likely to exercise any influence. and also New York, where UN headquarters is located, became the center of the spread of the COVID-19, and UN headquarters employees were all working at home. We had a great difficulties, and also UN, WHO that has the universality and expertise, they couldn't exercise any of their influence. On the contrary, at the level of the individual country, international cooperation through mini-lateral and bilateral led by some countries actually have been shown to be active. In addition, the international community, which has experienced the widespreading detrimental impact of the transboundary infectious disease, is feeling keen need to further strengthen preparation so as to address soft issues such as climate change and cybersecurity, as well as pandemic. In this environment, looking at the directions of the international order surrounding multilateral diplomacy, first of all, as Dr. Jung already talked many things about globalization and internationalization, I believe that the possibility of reverse or reinvention of globalization is widely opened. On the one hand, if countries around the world are taking the path of self-development or self-survival, such as reshoring or protectionism in trade, there's also possibility that the reverse globalizations will become the trend. And on one hand, the need for the international cooperation on soft issues is also emerging. So there is once again the possibility of further discussions of re-globalization or reinventing globalizations to improve the global governance may be triggered. As the limitations of the universal international organizations have been exposed, it is expected that there will be a greater demand to improve universal multilateralism in the future. However, it is highly likely that the international community will find it difficult to find common denominator and come up with a meaningful consensus. So, as an alternative, there is a possibility that the revitalizations of the mutual solidarity and cooperation among small-sized countries is likely to emerge. In the process of revitalizing multilateralisms, countries like Korea, middle power, have a lot to do or can contribute greatly. Given that the middle power countries have grown on the basis of the multilateral international order, there are highly greater room that these countries are willing to contribute. And through the collective capacity, through solidarity, there are much room for middle power countries to take actions. Korea is looking for multilateral diplomacy that takes the lead by closely analyzing the new trends surrounding multilateral diplomacy created by COVID-19 pandemic. First of all, under pandemic, it is believed that Korea has responded to this situation based on the openness, transparency, democracy. Korea has repositioned itself as a country that can definitely play a role in new norm-based international order, and it is necessary to contribute to the formation of the international norms and consensus that can operate in the event of the global crisis. It has already contributed to the consensus to seek ways to facilitate the movement of the essential personnel, such as medical personnel, businessmen, etc., even under the opportunity of multilateral meetings such as G20 Special Video Summit, and even under the pandemic in discussions on improving global health governance represented by WHO and IHR will take the initiative. Professor Lee Seung-Joo talked about the leadership to be played by the middle power, and also Professor Kim talked about many other issues, but I believe it is necessary to induce the multilateralism to be played, which needs to be activated on the basis of the pandemic, not only to promote solidarity and cooperation between the participating countries, but also to be led to restore the universal multilateralism. As a way to launch a new series of friendship group at the UN, WHO, and UNESCO levels, together the will for cooperation with international organization, the United Nations Health and Security Friendship Group was launched, and also a series of friendship groups at the UN, WHO, and UNESCO level will also launch together the will for cooperation with international organization. We are working as the chairman and in this international organization, and we hope to see and produce meaningful results. This year, Korea is playing the chairmanship at the MICTA, and many multilateral organizations like MICTA can definitely play important role to strengthen global governance centered on the UN and WHO. And joint statement by foreign ministers participating at MICTA was adopted last April, and joint declarations by foreign ministers of multilateral solidarity was adopted in April and June as well. Professor Kim talked about the agenda. I believe that taking advantage of the momentum, such as raising interest in emergence of the issues as pandemic opportunity leading to the global issues as climate change, environment, and new technology, must be led by a country like Korea. During the 74th UN General Assembly, Korea presented a resolution which was adopted so that the International Day of Clean Air for Blue Sky was adopted, and once again, the global initiative to respond to the climate change and accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal was also adopted. And not only that, because Korea took initiative, the discussion related to the international community on the ripple effect of the new technology, including leading the adoptions of the resolutions of the new technology and human rights of the 41st Human Rights Council was adopted, and we plan to play such role. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Ham. You said that you were going to be sharing some personal opinions, and you have definitely shared your personal experience working at the front line of Korea's diplomatic policies and how Korea is working with other countries at this point in time. Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Ham. Now we've heard from all the 5 panelists, and based on these presentations, we would like to open the discussion session. Many people are joining us real time through YouTube, and if you have any questions or comments to the panelists, please send them to us, and we'll try to answer some of the questions during the course of our discussion. The first round, well, I would like to give 3 to 4 minutes to each panelist to answer the first question. So all the 5 panelists have said that the current multilateralism is at risk. And as for the solution for overcoming this risk, everybody seemed to have a slightly different opinion. Professor Kim has said that we need to have more value-based multilateralism. And Professor Li Xinhua has said that the existing values can square well with the values that Korea has been pursuing, so we need to stick to such values in reshaping the international order. Professor Lee has talked about a slightly different direction of change, so I would like to first ask about inclusive multilateralism and how Professor Li Xinhua, Professor Lee Seung-Joo would, what kind of opinions they have about inclusive multilateralism. I would like to give 3 minutes to each panelist.
Well, Professor Jo, I always have a great confidence. What impresses me greatly is sharing values. Countries that share value, we need to exercise collective cooperation. And in your presentation, you already talked about that cooperation among like-minded countries is important, but also like-situated countries need to cooperate and collaborate. That was very impressive. Still, the existing liberal multilateral values, when we talk about that, was mostly led by the United States or Western countries, and we just followed that so far. But the universal values or principles, it's not that we just followed because the United States was leading that, but rather those things were suitable to the universal principle. And you talked about inclusive multilateralism in 2020. July last month, UN Secretary General Guterres talked about renewed and inclusive multilateralism needs to be built. That was stated by the UN. What's the main point of that? That means based on the international law, based on human rights, sustainable development, we need to build our confidence, and based on that, multilateralism needs to be reborn or recreated. And also, it shouldn't be exclusive, more inclusive. So multilateralism that is more inclusive, not exclusive. And as you mentioned, it could be like a middle ground. Not only it swing to the Western country, but rather it's at the middle ground. And renewed and inclusive multilateralisms refer to the human rights, liberal values. I don't want to refer that as the Western value, but rather I'd like to call that as universal values. And based on that, inclusive multilateralism must be pursued. Therefore, the multilateralisms that you talk about is a little bit different than what I perceive. Now, competitive multilateralisms, I totally agree with you, because the actors, they are changing their attitude, and also they are trying to adopt a new elements that we have not witnessed before. Competitive multilateralism, when we talk about that here, the meaning of competition, it doesn't mean the competition itself, but rather our capacity to adapt ourselves to the changing environment that is defined as full of competition. So this is what countries are talking about. So at one side, cooperations and de-conflict and competition, the three elements needs to be addressed collectively within a new environment. It could be the post-COVID-19 or climate change environment, as Deputy Minister Ham talked about, the multilateralism that we can adapt to. That's the new meaning of the multilateralisms, not the existing liberal multilateralisms that we know. So competitive multilateralism can be different than what I think.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Professor Li Xinhua has said that having a coalition with the like-minded countries can give us a leverage in the strengthening U.S.-China rivalry, and Professor Kim Tae-hwan has said that with the value-based perspective, and when we create a collaboration platform with other countries, he said that this is where we can have more leverage. So can you focus on that perspective? Professor Lee Seung-Joo? Professor Kim Tae-hwan has proposed inclusive multilateralism idea, and it is quite intriguing, and it's something that we should definitely consider as we reform the existing multilateralism. So instead of making comments about the inclusive multilateralism per se, I would like to talk about several preconditions that need to be satisfied before inclusive multilateralism can be successfully realized. And then also add some of my own comments. Preconditions are like as follows. Multilateralism without any adjective in front of it, so-called prototype form of multilateralism, is when strong companies provide public goods and exercise leadership. On the other hand, the multilateralism framework can mitigate or tame strong power, so it had these ambivalent aspects. So multilateralism per se, if it functions properly within the framework, strong powers, power politics can be tamed and controlled to a certain level. But we are now talking about the crisis of multilateralism because the current version of multilateralism is no longer capable of taming the great powers. So, in terms of pursuing comprehensive, inclusive multilateralism, I think it has great potential for taming the great powers, but the important thing would be the timing. In evolving the value-based multilateralism, many countries will be facing the challenges of the strategic rivalry between the United States and China. Some countries will be forced to choose between these two great powers based on threat perception. Each country has different perception of threat, and pursuing inclusive multilateralism when each country has different perception threat could be quite challenging in reality. So the timing between these two, or we should narrow down the timing gap. And that would be one of the biggest challenges that we should be able to overcome. And based on my understanding of inclusive multilateralism, it has a lot of creative components, and I agree with all of those common components, but I still believe it is too nationalistic. And when I talked about the transnational cooperation in my presentation, in pursuing multilateralism now, we need not just the state actors, but non-state actors like civic society or the academia, schools, businesses. So non-state actors should be accommodated in this process, and it's an important challenge to do so. Inclusive multilateralism should be based on harmonization of nationalistic and non-nationalistic perspective. And one more point I would like to add is regardless of what form of multilateralism takes form, all types of multilateralism need some kind of national foundation. Up until now, liberalist international or liberalist multilateralism has been possible because it was consistent with the nationalistic ideas. In the international politics, it is so-called the embedded liberalism. So embedded liberalism means that liberalist ideas were very much rooted in domestic politics. But over the past decade, globalization has advanced greatly, and multilateralism for external affairs or liberalist and began to move away from domestic politics. And the gap has been widened because of COVID-19. So we have clearly witnessed this widening gap. So regarding multilateralism, whenever we talk about multilateralism, various forms of multilateralism, we need to very clearly talk about national platform that enable such multilateralism. And only when we discuss that would we make some progress in our discussion for restoration of multilateralism. Thank you very much for the wonderful comment, Professor Kim Tae-hwan. So would you like to respond to these two panelists? Thank you very much for your insightful comments. And I would like to, I agree with the two panelists for the most part, but in spite of that, I would like to make 2 points. First, Professor Li Xinhua said that she talked about universality for the humanity, and personally, I don't accept that. I don't agree with that. Calling them universal values might sound very arrogant and biased. Well, you could even say there's cultural absolutism. my idea of culture is absolutely true, and it should also be true for you as well. This is also embedded in some religions like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And, well, depending on what kind of culture you have, you might have quite different values. You know, wearing masks in COVID pandemic, Korean people voluntarily put on the masks to protect themselves and protect others. This is civic participation. But when you look at other countries, I read in the newspaper yesterday that German people put on tent over their face, refusing to put on mask and demonstrating against mask wearing. Well, each culture has quite different values. The point I'm trying to make is that each civilization, each culture has different ideas, and ideas are not ideologies. So ideas could be different by culture to culture, but they don't have to be in contrast or in conflict. The important thing is recognizing and accommodating such differences and agree that your ideas and values are different from mine, and I cannot force my values and ideas on you. Regarding LGBTQ issues, especially the Russian Orthodox religion, they think it's mocking the God. It's totally against the God's ideas. That's what they believe. But before we say others are wrong, we should be able to recognize and accept the differences of others. And through that, we can learn to respect each other. It's a very important aspect of inclusive multilateralism, recognizing and accepting the differences. But once we try to say something is universal, this will lead to the collapse or breakdown of multilateralism. The second point I would like to make is that liberalist ideas, liberalism in the past 20 years has been overexpanded. Sometimes it has expanded democracy, but from the other country, it could be seen as if they're being imposed in terms of liberal expansion. Some countries even mobilized military forces to accept democracy. That's what Iraq War was all about. Because of the neoliberalist myth, it has created huge amount of inequality. And domestic platform for liberalism, I think over the past 3 decades, have been the side effect of overexpanded liberalism. And it has led to the emergence of authoritarianism, populism. My question to you is, we need to have an objective understanding of multilateralism. Multilateralism has some flaws. We need to recognize that. The moment we say the newly invented multilateralism should be based on liberalist ideas, we are taking sides. And it will aggravate conflict and confrontation. If we try to still stick to liberalist multilateralism. To be more specific, I'm a liberalist. But I hate using the word strategy, but when we talk about realistic strategy, having centrist values does not mean we are going to abandon liberalist ideas. We are just being flexible. Let's look at the European Union. They're opposing power politics of great powers, like they opposed the US invasion of Iraq. So regarding power politics, they can oppose, but EU countries are very strong champions of liberalist values and ideas. What about ASEAN? Regarding liberalist values, their attitude is like so-so. They are not as strong champions as the EU, but in spite of that, ASEAN when it comes to the strategic rivalry between the US and China. Well, we have a lot of like-minded partners in ASEAN. By taking middle-of-the-road attitude, we can create a big denominator with the partner countries, and we would have a much better chance of creating inclusive coalition. Thank you very much.
Well, I wish we had more time. We can have a lengthy discussion addressing this topic alone. Well, maybe when we have another round, if you'd like to emphasize once again, two other Professors Lee and Professor Lee can talk about that. Now, we are doing a live broadcasting, and there are a lot of questions. So this question goes to Deputy Minister Ham. Professor Lee already talked about that, and within the multilateral international order, in order to exercise our influence as a middle power, we need to acquire public support. How are you going to secure that? Yesterday, at the keynote address delivered by Minister Kang, in order to revive internationalism, Korea needs to take initiative, play leading role. But most of all, Minister Kang talked about securing public support. So, to exercise leadership as a middle power and contribute to the international order, it accompanies responsibility, but to fulfill our responsibility, general public needs to understand that and needs to support that. So in the multilateral diplomacy, acquiring public support cannot be an easy thing. So among the questions raised by the participants, there were questions such as, in order to play middle power, we need to get a confidence or trust among the public. How are you going to do that? And this person who asked a question was, how is Korea planning to acquire confidence from other countries? But on top of that, I'd like to ask you, how are you planning to acquire confidence and trust from other countries as well as from the Korean people? Thank you for asking this question. Three professors had a heated discussions, and I was thinking about making my own views, but let me just say my thoughts and then answer the question raised by President Oh. My experience at UN, let me share that. The international cooperation based on the multilateralism is much more complicated, much more complex than we think. Because if you dive deeper into multilateralism, it's extremely important to expand denominators. Here, sometimes compromise, sometimes yield, compromise needs to be there. And as it was mentioned, Korea needs to play a certain role in order to acquire confidence, and I totally agree with that. And Korea is a middle power, and in order to pursue inclusive international cooperation, there are three things we can do. First, global governance needs to be institutionalized, it needs to become on norms, and here Korea can play the role of manager. Second, other countries can create a consensus, or Korea can play the facilitator role in creating consensus or agreement. Third, the global issues, global soft issues like climate change or other issues, in order to address these soft issues, Korea can play the role of catalyst, and we can definitely come up with the solutions. So based on these three roles, Korea can definitely make the whole world know about Korea's multilateral diplomacy. Now, going back to the question raised by President Oh, how are we going to acquire public support? Minister Kang yesterday talked about acquiring the support as well as playing a really leading role, and in light of that, let me tell you, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we've been working really hard to acquire public support. We have activated communications and engagement with the civic organizations. We have hosted various conferences and seminars to make people understand what we do, and also to facilitate Korean young people working at the international organizations. We also made extra efforts. This year, as you know, we are celebrating 70th anniversary of Korea's membership of the UNESCO, and next year is once again we are celebrating a special momentum as we join the international organizations such as UN. So there are many events planned to celebrate our role in the international organization. Together with the international organization, we have had various track records, and looking back, why do we need international organization? Why do we need to improve our role? Why do we need to strengthen our role? I believe in the process of that, we can acquire public understanding. And many of you are very much interested in Korea's advancement into international organization. When we joined UN, there were around 130 at the members of the UN, and more than 1,000 people have joined, and in terms of the quantity it has expanded, and 130 people work at the international organization, but now more than 1,000 people are working in the international organizations. That's another way to do so.
Thank you very much. So multilateralism is changing based on transnational actors. So the new multilateralism should also be based on non-actors. So like NGOs, and you said the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is cooperating closely with the NGOs and so on. Dr. Jung-chul, you talked about the mutual dependency, and mutual dependency has been an important foundation for multilateralism, but with COVID pandemic, there has been efforts to deliberately weaken mutual dependency. And such trend is expanding around the world. So with weak mutual dependency, how can we realize the multilateralism in the future? You've also talked about regional communities. In the first round, we talked about what should be the principles and values for restoring multilateralism. And in the trade and economic multilateralism, of course, mutual dependency is being weaponized, but at the same time, mutual dependency is weakening. So what should be the principles or the values for multilateralism? Thank you very much for the wonderful question. So with Trump administration and Brexit happening, you could say that we are past the booming years of multilateralism. Because if the world economy was doing great and is continuously growing, then trade liberalization will be seen as an ultimate virtue, making everybody better off. But we have seen bipolarization, inequality rising, and that has created a lot of internal problems like the elephant curve that I talked about. For domestic politics and international norms and values, there has been a lot of confrontation or clashes. And mutual dependency used to be an important value in the past, but now, because of the domestic priorities, they're being pushed to the back burner. So in the past, we used to value rule-based multilateralism, but now USTR of the United States, Robert Lighthizer, has written in Wall Street Journal that WTO's arbitration function and appeal court is not functioning properly. So dispute resolution must be done bilaterally. So multilateral institutions like the WTO can be used for discussions on norms and regulations and negotiations, but disputes should ultimately be resolved bilaterally based on the reasoning of power. In such world, collective knowledge or collective cooperation will lose ground, and middle power like Korea or smaller countries might have to lose under such circumstances. Therefore, WTO is in crisis, but trying to restore multilateralism through WTO, well, on top of that, we need an alternative channel like CPTPP or RCEP or Korea-China-Japan FTA. Such alternative cooperation or agreement can supplement WTO. And regarding the policies, policy coordination would be more important going forward. Like we have seen a shortage of supply in masks and medical equipment and medicine, and we have greatly restricted exports of such critical items, but some countries still imposed import tariff on those critical items, restricting trade. And under such pandemic crisis, well, we try to liberalize such trade regulations, and many countries in Europe, London, they have deregulated such trade restrictions. But once we find stability and we find our feet, then some countries might go back to imposing import tariff. But we should never do that. We need to coordinate our policies to prevent that from happening. When we have no such regulations, the suppliers and the customers will be able to benefit from stable supply, reduced uncertainties, and better price and better cost of production. So the suppliers and customers can have a win-win situation. But in order to make that happen, we need a properly functioning multilateral mechanism. And it should be in a different direction, because digital transformation is happening very rapidly, and non-face-to-face services, even though everything is restricted, but digital corporations are doing quite well in the American stock market, Korean stock market as well. Therefore, international cooperation and multilateral institutions might have to respect or pay more attention to digital business. So we should let the market decide the policies instead of policy deciding the market. So we are now living in a changed world with different requirements, and we need to find the best way to meet the needs for digital multilateralism. Thank you very much.
Well, suitable to the 21st century, what we need is the multilateralism that is more adaptable and suitable to the 21st century. We still have 30 more minutes to go, and I am getting a lot of questions, and also there are questions that appeared in my mind upon listening your presentations and your discussion. Let me pose a question to Professor Li Xinhua. There are great questions. First of all, you talked about trilateral cooperation among China, Korea, Japan. Let me read. In case of Japan, free and open Indo-Pacific era was proposed by Prime Minister Abe, and multilateralism is connected with the Western value in case of Japan. But in case of China, multilateralisms are not pursued very actively. So Japan is focusing on the multilateralism, but what kind of strategy do they really need to persuade China and to create a cooperation among three countries? Because Professor Lee, you talked about the importance of trilateral cooperations, but the philosophy, the values among three countries are very different. In case of Japan, it's more closer. It's actually, they are sharing the same value with that of the United States, but China and Japan have a different philosophy and values. value. So within this round, please limit your discussions in 3 minutes. In fact, when I look at China, persuading China is not easy either for Korea or for Japan, because there was already existing alliance among Korea, Japan, and United States, but with a lot of thorny issues between Japan and Korea, the alliance among US, Japan, Korea is also shaking, and there are a lot of difficulties going on, but when trilateral cooperation is strengthened, according to Professor Kim, probably we might confront United States, but because Japan and Korea are having a difficult times, U.S. is playing the mediator role or big brother role. In the same context, how can we persuade China? Japan, Korea, and China, we are sharing the same values. In case of the rule of law and human rights, we all put a great emphasis on that. Then, how can we build healthy relations with China? And how can the three countries work together? Because realistically speaking, there are a lot of issues to be ironed out. And China can be regarded as a big brother by Korea and Japan, but can it really resolve our issues? So instead of persuading China, I don't want to think in that scenario, but rather we need to go hand in hand, because these three countries, we share the value, we had the traditions, and based on that, we can work together. And on top of that, let me just add one more thing. The pandemic or climate change issues, all of these are the negative aspect of the globalization. So of course, globalization have given a lot of benefit, but also at the same time, since it broke down the barriers, there are a lot of issues. So the more sophisticated, more redefined globalizations, that is more human-like globalizations, we need to have that. So more humane and more regulated globalizations is what we need. In that sense, the region-based multilateralisms need to be revised, and we need to propose our ideas to China, to Japan, so that three countries, all three of them are really strong nations, and we need to create a consensus. So it's not like a persuading someone, but rather we need to seek together which direction we need to go. Thank you.
Thank you for the great comments. Multilateralism, as Professor Kim has said as well, is a process of recognizing and accepting the differences of each other. So within Korea, China, and Japan, there should be continued effort to create some kind of cooperative platform. And now, Professor Lee Seung-Joo, you have studied middle power diplomacy for a long time, and you have shared great ideas today as well. Middle power diplomacy is something that Korea has been engaged in for a long time. In this post-pandemic world and globalization 4.0 world, what should be the characteristics of Korea's middle power diplomacy? And middle power diplomacy probably would require a lot of commitment, contribution from Korea. So how can we be able to stay committed and make contribution for middle power diplomacy? Thank you for the question. Middle power diplomacy dates back not just in Korea but to other countries. It dates back a long time. And regarding middle power diplomacy, there is a various variety of assessment, ranging from positive ones to rather negative ones, pointing out the limitations of middle power diplomacy. So as you have said in your question, what should be the middle power diplomacy in COVID-19 pandemic? But before the pandemic, what was the middle power diplomacy like? Let me talk about that. Of course, there were various forms of middle power diplomacy, but they were basically based on norm-based diplomacy. Norm-based diplomacy was an important pillar of middle power diplomacy. Strong power diplomacy was basically dependent on hard power diplomacy. So we had to recognize that as a fact. And in order to differentiate, the middle power countries moved away from hard power towards soft power diplomacy. And based on norms and values, they have tried to exercise model case of leadership. That is one of the common characteristics that we can see across all forms of middle power diplomacy. But in spite of that, one of the limitations of middle power diplomacy was that this can be only complementing the power politics of the strong powers. In the international order, the key leadership was exercised by the strong powers. In other words, middle powers in non-traditional security areas were newly emerging issues. Middle powers have exercised some level of leadership, but in traditional areas like security issues, they have clearly seen restrictions or limitations in exercising strong leadership. So when we consider these aspects, in what should the middle power diplomacy should focus on in this pandemic? As I've briefly mentioned in my presentation, the COVID-19 pandemic is taking place in the absence of leadership. So the absence of leadership of strong powers is basically what I'm talking about. Up until now, the middle powers leadership, middle powers diplomacy is very much different from that. Now, it's difficult to find any form of leadership of strong countries. The United States is so busy responding to COVID-19 and has no room or capacity to exercise global leadership. And America First policy of Trump administration has made it difficult for the U.S. to exercise global leadership. What about China? As Professor Li Xinhua has mentioned, and mask diplomacy, but China is still obsessed with its domestic interest. That's the basis for exercising mask diplomacy, wolf warrior diplomacy. So they also lack their concept or understanding of global leadership. So then what about Europe? EU's leadership limitation has been revealed by this pandemic. Italy, Germany, France, they had to focus their national capacity in responding to their domestic challenges. Globally, in this absence of leadership, we are now seeing the creation of a new environment for middle powers to exercise their leadership. And middle power diplomacy before and after pandemic should be distinguished and could be distinguished. As I briefly mentioned in my presentation, the space given to middle powers, will it stay open? There is a big question mark about that. The opportunity or window of opportunity open to middle powers will be open for a very short period of time. Middle powers, instead of exercising individual leadership, they need cooperation among middle powers. And Professor Kim Tae-won talked about inclusive multilateralism and centrist ideas, and middle power diplomacy can adopt certain elements of that. Whether it's values or any other things, middle power countries up until now have identified a lot of diversities among themselves, and our perception so far has been to see them as heterogeneity, and middle power countries are so different from each other, so their cooperation should be limited. But let us change our perspective. Heterogeneity could be a source of creative ideas, and source of diversity. Diversity is based on mutual complementariness and set the foundation for cooperation. So still, the window of opportunity for middle power is open, and we need knowledge power, and it can come from middle power cooperation. Thank you very much.
Once again, middle powers needs to exercise leadership, needs to recognize the needs and importance of playing pivotal role. Only then the international order can be revised. So this question goes to Professor Kim Tae-won.
So you have talked about the importance of soft power, and Korea does not have strong soft power yet. And in order to enhance Korea's public diplomacy capabilities, well, Korea's public diplomacy is strongly related to multilateral diplomacy. And based on softwares, Korea can help the world set the norms and values. So can you speak in 3 minutes? Thank you very much for your question. Korea is not strong in terms of its soft power, but I have a different opinion. And Korea, I think, is one of the strong powers when it comes to soft power. Personally, public diplomacy, there are two types of public diplomacy based on soft power. First is letting the other countries know who am I, promoting yourself around the world based on soft power. That's one form of public diplomacy, like Korean culture, Hallyu, or K-quarantine. Second form of public diplomacy is, of course, based on values and policies, institutions that we have that form our identity. Such form of public diplomacy is based on an important soft power asset, and the assets are mainly based on conceptions and norms, the power of norms and shared values. This is a source of very important soft power, and some scholars separate such soft power and call it social power. But my personal opinion as a scholar is that Korea has been leveraging soft power very well as a resource for public diplomacy. But we have been very good at promoting ourselves, our country, to others around the world. But we need to overcome the threshold. We need to take a step forward. So let the world, international community know what kind of values and directions that we are pursuing. And here, soft power comes from values, norms, ideas, or the so-called social power. And so the second form of public diplomacy needs to advance further. But I don't think Korea generally has weak soft power. Let us think about the European Union. It has normative power, and the normative power is based on traditional form of liberalism and democracy. But let us have a slightly different perspective of normative power through our public diplomacy, and developing the soft power for that would be a very important homework for us.
Thank you. Next question goes to Dr. Jung Chul. Universal international organizations like UN, WHO is also important, but there are many multilateral international organizations. In that sense, G20 is extremely important. 2008, because of the economic financial crisis, G20 played an important role, but nowadays its influence has shrunken. And in the era of COVID-19, if G20 can play a certain role, definitely we can bear some fruits. So how do you see, what's your take on the G20's future? What should be the Korea's role in G20? Yes, very important question. Thank you for asking that. G20 was created amid financial crisis in 2008. And because of G20, definitely Korea was able to reposition ourselves. We have strengthened our national power, and to overcome the financial crisis, we insisted on standing still and received a great response worldwide. In light of that, while we are suffering from COVID-19, G20 needs to play a greater role. It is regrettable that G20 is not doing so. But taking a closer look at the G20, as all of you have already mentioned, I mean, everything's interconnected. As Kim Tae-won, Professor Kim mentioned, yes, the soft power-led multilateralism, yes, we need that. I agree. But realistically speaking, for example, the Japanese impositions of the export restrictions, we have filed a suit against Japan to WTO, and do we need to resolve that bilaterally or how? Because if we rely on the WTO, but it's not making decisions, it's not presenting us the solutions that we need. In that sense, G20 can intervene and G20 can play an extremely important role. However, everything goes back to the original point. The hegemony, power competition between US and China is important. What is CPTPP? Because it comes from, it was originally including United States, but led by Japan. CPTPP study, although US withdrew, but still it was amazing, it was outstanding organization. But actually, Japan did a great things, but when US did not support and rather it withdrew CPTPP, although it was a mega FTA, it couldn't play any influence or exercise any influence at all. So in light of that, in order to create an organization or an influence where every country take part in, it could be soft power or whatever it is, we need to create a certain universal organizations. But these kind of organizations should not exclude neither US nor China. So we need to create that kind of framework.
So because of the COVID virus, we have focused mainly on what's happening in advanced nations and have not been paying enough attention to what is happening in developing countries. So we need to have stronger sense of responsibility in resolving the global challenges. And my last question is to Deputy Minister Ham Sang-wook, which is related to one of the questions that was asked by the audience. And we've talked about the multilateralism of the UN and the UN trying to resolve 21st century problems with the 20th century regime. And because of the individual issues, the UN is probably the cause of this talk about fading of multilateralism. And Minister Ham Sang-wook has talked about the mini multilateralism-based initiatives. So what do you think about the future of the UN. The UN is going through a lot of reform now, but in the post-pandemic world, what should be the most important reform for the United Nations? So what should be the role of Korea in this new UN? I have 3 questions.
Well, it's a grandiose question, so I don't know where I should start. Regarding reform of the UN, yes, Secretary General Guterres have already talked about it ever since he was appointed. He even talked about totally shattering and breaking down the UN with an ambitious plan. He tried to pursue UN reform, mostly focusing on peace, development, and peacekeeping, etc., and adopted resolutions by UN, and since last year, actively pursued UN reform. But in order to implement full-fledged manner of the reform, COVID-19 occurred. Therefore, the fundamental reform, I believe, couldn't have taken place. Of course, UN needs to be reformed. We all agree and support that idea. And in the future, in order to strengthen UN, Korea has a plan to make a constructive contribution. Regarding mini-lateral or mini-multilateral consultative body, I told you that UN is a very complicated and complex organization. Within UN, group of friends was researched, and there are around 80 countries that belong to the group of friends. Because there are so many diverse mini multilateral bodies, group of friends among the group of friends needs to be created. That was even suggested. And maybe you are not familiar with that idea, but among the group of friends, we belong to these organizations, and around 6 to 7 group of friends organization, we are working as a chairman. Then, how and what Korea is doing as the leader or chairman, I cannot pinpoint out any kind of specific ideas. What I can talk about is, I think it was from 2024 to 2025, we are pursuing to become the non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. This is the 3rd trial that we are doing. During the remaining time, what we need to do is, as the non-permanent member of the Security Council, what kind of work we'll focus on, what role we'll play. We need to do that. Cybersecurity could be one example, and also development could be another area that we can work on. In relations with development, peace and security, development needs to be connected, and exercise how should we promote that. That can be one idea. In relations with youth, yes, we could lead that, and women, peace, security could be another agenda that we can lead. So, keeping these in mind, probably September, mid-September, celebrations of marking the 70th anniversary of Korea's joining of the UN and celebration and the establishment of the UN will be actually happen, and we'll be able to reconfirm the role of the UN in that process. Health is and K-quarantine is highly evaluated by the world. Therefore, we can also play a certain role in the health area.
Thank you very much. You have been very punctual with time. So we have 3 minutes. So I need only 1 minute for wrap-up comments. So if there is any panelist that would like to share additional comment, or as Deputy Minister Ham has mentioned, Korea, out of multiple agenda, what kind of agenda do you think we should focus on? So in the post-pandemic world, regarding the agenda, what kind of agenda do you think is more critical than the other? If you have any of those opinions, let us know. Yes, Professor Kim Tae-hwan. I will be very brief. Agenda setting is very important, especially having agenda in this inclusive coalition would be critical. And first, there is this centrist norm of active peace and another centrist norm of human security. They are both very comprehensive concepts, but they are greatly duplicated, overlap. One more thing, that I would like to add is the UN's SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, 17 SDGs. And if we combine that, I think we can come up with a very specific agenda, like restoration, inequality-related agenda. So instead of just talking about the centrist norms, if we can mix these centrist norms with the actual SDGs that UN is working on, and then we can select and concentrate among those, and I think we can have a great agenda. Thank you very much. Professor Li Xinhua.
Next year, we will be celebrating 30th anniversary of becoming the UN member. We were recipient, but now we are the donor at UN. And as a follower of the rules in the past, now we are a rule decision-making country. And we live in the era when leadership has dissipated. So now is the time the middle power can play critical role, a pivotal role. So now is the time that Korea can play a certain role. That could be regarded as an achievement. But still, there are some mechanisms or, how should I say, the alternatives to counter superpower is not desirable. Instead of looking superpowers as our competitor or rival, we need to look at them as our partner. We need to work with them, coordinate with them. In light of that, this is a third trial that we are trying to become the non-permanent member of the Security Council. Instead of presenting too much diverse agenda, it's important that we choose one or two topics. I mentioned about PKO, peacekeeping operation. PKO is extremely good, but also peace building is important. There are a lot of things that we can do. Peace building between or among countries, and also there are a lot of countries that are suffering from the civil war. For that country, we can build peace. So that could be one agenda that we can address.
Thank you very much. Peace, security, development, and all the nexus is where Korea has a lot of important role to play. And because of the time issue, we have to wrap up now. It is regretful that we were not able to meet in person, but in spite of that, we've had great discussion and great questions, and it was a very informative and fruitful discussion. And the keywords presented by panelists, going beyond the isolationism of pandemic and multilateralism to promote coexistence, and as a middle power, what we can do here. We should not be trapped by principles or ideologies. We should be able to leverage this niche presented in front of Korea. Korea, it's an idea that resonates across the Korean diplomacy. And this year's IFANS Conference on Global Affairs is now concluded. And I continuously ask for your support and interest for KNDA's efforts. Thank you very much.